All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, How to Build an Anti-Racist Organization. This session is part of OrgVitality's virtual conference titled Moving Forward, Understanding the Employee Experience. Our goal is to bring you all content that will help you improve the employee experience as we move through this pandemic. We still have a couple of sessions left today. If you haven't had a chance, please head on over to orgvitality.com and check out the sessions we have left in the afternoon. It's not too late to sign up, and we'd love to have you at any of those sessions. Before we get started with this session, I just want to give a couple of housekeeping kinds of notes here. The first is that you will get these slides as well as a link to a recording of the session today. So please don't worry about taking detailed notes. Sit back and enjoy the content. I would encourage you to take down any questions you have throughout the presentation. We will try to save a few minutes at the end to do some live Q&A. So if you do have questions, please enter them in the Q&A panel of Zoom. We'll be monitoring that. And I will say that we do have a short time, so if we don't get to all of the questions today, we will follow up with you via email. So again, don't hesitate to enter your questions there in the Q&A panel. Last point here, we are a survey company, so of course at the conclusion of this webinar, there will be a survey. So please do take a few minutes to give us your feedback there so that we can bring you the best content in future sessions like this. So with all that said, let me move forward and we can do some introductions here. My name is Victoria Hendrickson. I'm a partner and vice president with OrgVitality, working on the consulting side, primarily with employee surveys and employee research, particularly in this I&D space. So very excited to chat with you today, but also very excited to introduce you to my colleague, Sertrice. If you want to chime in here.
Yeah, so I'm Sertrice Grice, and I am a consultant and project manager here at OrgVitality, also working a lot with employee surveys and like team surveys, 180s, things like that, and really passionate about the D&I space too. So excited for this conversation today.
Excellent. So we're going to move into the topic here. It's a deep one, so want to get right into the nitty-gritty. We're all here because anti-racism is an important topic. I think a lot of us have been thinking about this, given our social context of late. It's certainly a more visible and spoken about topic in terms of the term anti-racism. But I will say the explicit pursuit of building an anti-racist organization is a new one for a lot of people and for a lot of companies. And I want to say that's not a bad thing. The important thing is that we know it's important and we're committed to change. And the term anti-racism isn't new, but for mainstream organizations to really go beyond counts and diverse representation in their workforce and to take on that work of being anti-racist, it is. So we'll talk about those definitions and distinctions between terms in a moment, but I do want to highlight the context around the current conversation to ground us a bit here. So, I think a lot of us have been engaged in conversations around the importance of having a diverse workforce. A lot of our organizations have been committed to having a diverse workforce that supports the communities they serve, and we've been committed to including employees regardless of their background for quite some time. And I do want to say that this is really important work that's in progress, and it's not to be downplayed, but also want to underscore that our social context is telling us that that's just not enough. It's time to take a stronger stance and a more proactive stance to be consciously anti-racist in our organizations. So that said, introducing a new label isn't the work itself. It's the signal of a new effort, and it's one that is not easy, and it's not done overnight. The phrases on the page here are the top hits from my recent Google search of anti-racist company. So I think what this reflects is that leaders are seeing that this isn't an option anymore. They're seeing that this is a long road ahead. And I think a lot of people are learning that there's a lot they don't know. We know there's a lot to address, And it's really this question of where do we start with this big, important piece of work? We don't have all the answers today, but we do want to break down what it means to be an anti-racist organization. How do we take that social goal and talk about it in terms of our organizations, and what can we do with employee listening programs to support that effort? In our short time together today, Sertrice and I are going to go through 4 main points. So the first 2 are really foundational: what it means to be an anti-racist organization and the barriers to achieving that. There's a reason that our organizations are not anti-racist. I think these are really important pieces to begin with, not just in terms of us today on the phone, but these are also points worth discussing in your organization to gain some common language, understanding, and goals. And once we've spoken through those 2 points and laid that foundation, we'll move on to the more tangible aspect of using employee feedback to understand your organization's baseline and think about how to move forward with the feedback and really make it a part of your organizational culture in a way that will last. So with that, I do want to start with some definitions of what it means to be an anti-racist organization. Many of you have probably been doing some reading on this generally and what it means for you personally, or just out in the world, and I strongly suggest doing that work. But I want to anchor today's conversation in a definition here that is specific to organizations rather than people or society generally. So the definition here from Laura Morgan Roberts says that an anti-racist organization means to recognize the permanence of racism in organizations and communities, and recognize that racism is a system of disproportionate opportunities and penalties based on skin color. So unpacking that a little bit, to me, the first part of being an anti-racist organization means acknowledging that systemic racism exists in the workplace, and it does have an adverse impact to people of color. And this is sometimes hard to recognize, especially if you're with an organization that you feel really passionately about. This is true of well-meaning organizations, that there is still racism in your organization and it is having impact. So there's a responsibility to acknowledge that it is there, and then to do the work of digging deep to find where is it having an impact, and find ways to identify how we can make our systems equitable for everyone. Typically, we see that racial bias shows up in long-standing policies and procedures. And often this is in implicit ways, not explicit, not conscious anymore. The point of this is not to play a blame game, but to say, where is this still showing up? It shows up in norms, general routines, policies, and procedures. This can look like, where do we recruit from? Do we have a history of recruiting from mostly white colleges? Are mentorships mostly with white leaders that feel comfortable with people who look like them or have similar backgrounds as they do? Maybe it looks like a supply chain that doesn't include minority-owned businesses. The list really goes on, and it does depend on the makeup of your organization and what you do. Again, these are often remnants of historical decisions. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's explicit day-by-day decisions that are consciously trying to impart racism, but over time, if we don't address these remnants and these pieces that are in the system, they do continue to perpetuate systemic racism by granting greater opportunity and greater access to some groups over others. And I think that we can all agree that that's something we don't want to do. And I do want to say, starting this work and investigating where these things are can be disheartening. Coming to terms with all the ways that racism may show up in your organization can also feel overwhelming. And so I do want to take a moment to echo a point that yesterday's speaker, Omri Johnson, made, and that's that every company has good. Every company is doing a lot of good and in different ways. And we have to recognize and start with that. So even though your company does have room to grow, this isn't a call to lose faith. It's a call to invest even further. So I encourage you to hold both of those as you begin this work. dismantling these systems of racism isn't going to happen overnight. So it does take that faith and investment that we're going to build on the good. And so with that, we want to take a look at some tangible things that you can do and think about as practices that are part of an anti-racist organization. And so I've got a list here, and it's by no means an exhaustive list of actions that can be taken, but it's a list to consider. Some will be more relevant for your organizations than others. And across these, an organization can begin to address systems like equitable pay, culture of openness and inclusion, and ways to give back to organizations that are actively addressing these issues in a larger social context. So just to name a couple and give some examples. One, recognizing that systemic racism exists. Some of you may have seen Ben and Jerry's open letter discussing the impacts of, as they call it, white supremacy on our culture. And I think it's really important, the way that they acknowledge what exists and what needs to change. Another is being open to the likelihood that systemic racism exists in your company and that mistakes have been made with this. Loisel is a company, their logo is at the bottom right here, and they acknowledge that they don't have enough representation in their leadership ranks, and they made some goals of how they'd like to change that. And I think that's a really important message to send. There are a lot of companies who have made commitments to hiring diversity. I would encourage, doing the same with your supply chain. Same thing with equitable pay. A lot of organizations are beginning this work. Another thing companies can do is donate to anti-racist organizations who are, really leading social change. Intel's a company that's done this. Target's a company that's donated and supported peaceful demonstrators aligned with Black Lives Matter. And then, the final point on the page is being open and transparent about mistakes and learnings. And I want to underscore that last point. That mistakes will be made, and the key is to learn from them. So no one is perfect, but I think a key about being an anti-racist company is that we'll recognize when mistakes have been made and commit to doing better. We can't be so afraid to do this work the wrong way, or so afraid that we might offend someone somewhere that we don't do this work at all. So the key isn't that you have to know everything, but the key is to do a work that's informed as possible, as expedient as possible, and to listen and course correct as you go. While mistakes may be made, a well-crafted, we're sorry, we'll do better is going to win over minimizing an issue every time. So I'm going to pause for a moment. I've been talking about some of the ways to be an anti-racist organization and what that can look like. But there are a lot of reasons that we're not already anti-racist organization and barriers in place that make it difficult work. So I'm going to hand it to Sertrice to talk through some of those.
Thanks. So as Victoria just spent time touching on, one of the first barriers is actually that admission, right? So admitting that there is a problem can be hard. It can be hard to admit our flaws. A lot of us want to think, this doesn't happen here, right? We're in a great place. So one solution to get over that mindset of, nope, this isn't here, is taking advantage of the current climate in society right now. Everyone is reflecting on it, looking at their behaviors, working to make improvements. It's a really big topic in society. So jump on that bandwagon, right? And paint it in that light of, everyone's doing this right now. Everyone's doing reviews. We're not saying we have a problem, but let's just check. Let's just get in there and just double check to make sure. So that way our employees know that we're willing to support them, because people really appreciate that honesty and the fact that you're willing to dive deep and learn and work on yourself. Another barrier is simply knowing what racism is. And I know that can sound kind of crazy, but it can be really difficult if it's not something that you're used to living with. So of course, we're all clear on overt racism. So running around using the N-word or physical violence directed towards people of a certain race. We can look at hard numbers for hiring discrimination. But when it comes to covert racism, right, what is cultural appropriation, are? What are microaggressions? That can be harder to discern. So the solution here would be studying up, and this is personally, but as an organization as a whole as well. So pull together informational webinars, trainings, documents that can be offered to employees to help them learn. And in turn, that's going to help your organization as well. And there are a number of great resources that already exist in the world that you can pull together and offer or utilize to create and brand into your own. But it's just important to have those things out there so we know what we're talking about. And then the next barrier is getting that information from employees. So depending on your culture at your company, it can be scary for employees to honestly share their negative experiences. And without that honest feedback, it's difficult for you as a company to know what to fix. So the solution here is you really need to dive into your culture. Find out, why are people not feeling safe speaking up about things? And this in itself may actually show you where you have room for growth in this space as a starting point. So outside of barriers, I wanted to talk about employee feedback. So as we mentioned earlier, employee surveys, that can be a first step. You really need to be able to hear from your employees and learn where they're having issues in this space. So we recommend starting with a small targeted survey and building from there. And there are a few key topics to cover in your survey when the goal is addressing race. So the first one is belongingness. So ensuring that everyone feels welcome. Research has been done over the years, and it strongly demonstrates that having a sense of belonging in an organization is paramount to one's happiness at work. And this is a hurdle that many organizations have yet to successfully master when it comes to race. And so it's critical to check in to ensure that all employees feel that they can be themselves. So this may be how they speak when they're in the company, or what clothing they feel comfortable wearing, things like that. But it can also relate to companies' leadership. So can they see themselves in a leadership role, someone who looks like them, right? So making sure they feel like they can fit in. The next one is safety. So making sure that they feel safe discussing the topic of race. So the topic of race can be an uncomfortable one to address. And in some places, it may be even perceived as downright inappropriate or unacceptable. And this is something that needs to change. We need to feel comfortable with the uncomfortable, is a phrase that I like to embrace. Organizations should really work to make these conversations more acceptable and commonplace in the space. So the next one is focusing on equal opportunities. So this is one that is probably comes to mind for people. People tend to immediately think of selection numbers in terms of inclusion and diversity, right? How many people are you bringing in? But it's also important and vital to confirm that once hired, employees are having fair and equal access to opportunities in the organization, such as who's getting certain roles, trainings that are available, making sure mentors are available and accessible to all, promotions, anything in that realm, just making sure that you're not just pulling these people into your organization, but once they're there, you are committed to making sure they can still grow with your team. And lastly, looking at leadership. So be clear about your leadership's commitment to diversity and inclusion and being anti-racist. So employees are going to have more confidence in their company when leadership's words are actually backed up by concrete actions. So gathering and assessing employee perceptions on the organization's actions is a smart way to determine if the initiatives your organization has already implemented are having the desired effect. We at OrgVitality developed a free 15-item anti-racist organization pulse survey to get at exactly these topics that I just covered. And the survey also includes 2 demographic items that touch on race and gender. And that's because when talking about the subject of race, we really recommend looking at your results in relation to different key demographics to help you fully gauge how different employees are experiencing life at your organization. Now, depending on your organization, some of these demographic cuts may be small. However, I really want to stress that it's vital not to dismiss the results due to in size. And I know for those of us who really like our numbers and data, that's something that can be hard to hear and that we want to shy away from. But the whole point of a survey like this is to hear the voices of your employees, especially those minorities who are underrepresented. So it's important to take note of all of that feedback, even if their in size is small. So I thought it would be fun to kind of look at some potential data. So we've had a couple of organizations utilize our tool in our system, and we're beginning to see a few trends that I wanted to talk about today. So across the board, items related to safety and, coworkers standing up if something inappropriate is said, or knowing how to even just report incidents of discrimination. Those things are the items we're seeing on the most positive end. This is where organizations already have good trends in place of people supporting each other and feeling safe and addressing this. So that's good. And we've seen that consistent across demographics. Now, on the low end, what we're seeing are those opportunities. So the opportunities for promotions or hiring and things like that. And actually, when we cut by race, we then start to see leadership items appear as well. So are our leaders actively addressing this, and are they authentic? Are they walking the talk? So those are the things we're seeing on the low end. But then the last thing I wanted to touch on was that we also have an open and comment section. So with that, we include a space for suggestions on how the company could improve and be more inclusive. And in the comments, you find people elaborating on the items that have already scored low. And there were some really great comments that could get leadership teams thinking. For instance, one company that went through has storefront locations, and many comments were mentioning that although the product is advertised as being for all people, all of the locations are in predominantly white neighborhoods. So that's something where you can stop and think, maybe we need to revisit where we're opening stores and how we're coming to that decision to see if you can truly be accessible to all. And opening stores is something that's really large, right? And that takes a lot of research and input, and there may be other factors. So, and that could be something that could take a lot of time. On the other end of the spectrum, there was also feedback to simply play a diverse set of music in stores. And that's something that is a much smaller request, and maybe something that hasn't crossed your CEO's mind, right? Is that something they're thinking of, what's happening in stores of the music they play? So these comments can really be a great way to get a wide range of potential solutions that you may or may not have considered in your organization. So these were just some quick sample insights I thought would be interesting to see from what we've experienced so far with people looking in this space and using this survey. And now Victoria is going to talk a bit more about when your feedback isn't that great.
Thanks, Sertrice. So, we're doing this survey to get some feedback. And let's say when you get that feedback, it isn't perfect, and that's okay. This isn't the kind of diversity survey you're administering for a report card that names you a best place to work. It's the first step of an intervention. It's the first step of beginning the work of anti-racism. So, I would see variance in your results, and a lower score here and there is actually a helpful guide in knowing where to prioritize so that you can really begin your work where you need to the most. And I would say that action planning in this kind of work is different from traditional survey work, where you're driving results down to the most local level for action planning and really having kind of a bottoms up approach. While an anti-racist organization is the goal of everyone and does require support throughout the organization, I would say it really has to start at the top. This really does have to come from top leadership, and often I think your job in managing the survey is going to be setting up leaders with the data and messages that they need to bring this message across the organization and call to action. So you're really setting them up to succeed more than pushing the data down throughout the organization. So Once you have this data, I would say the first step is really going to be the organization-wide messages. What's your baseline? Don't be afraid of what that baseline is. I think transparency is most important here. And looking at how you would describe the culture in terms of strengths and opportunities. While we are looking to improve, it's also a time to celebrate the things you are doing right. And I think, as Sertrice showed in the review of results a moment ago, there are things organizations are doing well. And so we don't want to downplay that. We want to build on those strengths. And when you start looking into those opportunities, we do need to prioritize. So rather than dwelling on scores that aren't perfect, look for hotspots in terms of employee segments that needed targeted support. Look for the specific behavioral items that you can support. And I would say, look for ways to support leaders by grounding these messages in data, not just, this certain group is low or this one item is low, but how can you help them tell the story in a way that is grounded in the data and lived experience of your employees, in a way that's really going to resonate. And I would say also, this is a time to partner across the organization. So delivering this message is going to take partnership with organizational groups like your communications group, any DEI kinds of committees, affinity groups, et cetera. You really want to find every avenue that you can get this into the organization. And I want to say that while getting this into the organization is an important first step, if there's one thing I want to emphasize today, it's going to be the importance of keeping that momentum going and keeping the conversation active. This is going to start with learning more. Survey is a great place to start, but in order to drive change, we need to really dig deep. So understanding the specific issues, where they show up, the impact of other organizational dynamics. This is a great opportunity to talk to people and learn more in focus groups or interviews, and also to go really deep with advanced analytics. So, go beyond slicing by race and gender, get into decision trees and discriminant analyses, network analysis, really to, again, help you find those hot spots in the organization and help you target those initial interventions. We know that you can't help everyone at 100% all the time, so how can you really prioritize? And then upon learning more, you're going to find you have work to do. Some's going to be on the system side and, how systems operate within the company, things like hiring, pay and promotions, and some's going to be about the culture, how people interact, include, and collaborate with one another. For improving systems, you're going to need to go backwards and learn what patterns do your system perpetuate? Where do you recruit from? How do you evaluate, promote, and reward people? Do those systems have built-in bias that you need to rework? In supporting the culture, this is where you want to get employees involved. I highly recommend the use of employee resource groups or affinity groups, where people who are interested can dig into the issues and identify ways to support one another. This is a great opportunity to get ideas from the people who are really most passionate, and it's often a great place to tap for ideas on how to move forward. Other ways you can get people involved include giving them avenues to support community groups doing anti-racist work. So, if you can't give an employee resource group opportunity, allow people the opportunity to go volunteer or provide matching donations. There's a lot of ways to do this. Basically, my suggestion is show support of your employees doing this work. And finally, set up your leaders to succeed. I spoke a little bit about, giving them the right pieces of data and messages to bring this throughout the organization. Also give them the right opportunities to speak about these issues in different venues, whether they're more comfortable with a company overall venue or targeted groups. Give them the opportunity to get out in front of this and share the organizational values from an accurate and informed place. Undoubtedly, this is a really daunting list. It's a big list. This is the kind of work that happens over many, many years. And so while it's important to hold this list, I also want to pass it to Sertrice to boil it down to a list of what each of you can do today after you leave the webinar.
Yeah, so this is going to vary depending on where you are in the process. Each organization is on its own journey, but here's a few potential first steps. So if you're early on, the first step, as we discussed thoroughly at the beginning of the webinar, is acknowledging that you may have a problem at your organization. It's likely that systemic racism exists in some capacity, so getting into that. And then the next one connected to that is getting that buy-in from your senior leadership. It's important to have leadership on board and pushing these messages as well to get where you need to go. Next would be hearing from your employees, not just assuming you know where those problems exist, but really getting that input to find out where you need to put in the work. Next is, once you have that feedback, looking into how you're going to address it. So if you know where your pain points are, how can you get there? And lastly is on a personal note, making sure that you do some personal reflection and see what you personally can contribute to making your company culture more anti-racist. And I went through those a little quick because I noticed that we are right at time. So that is our quick summary there today. And then just to look ahead, I did want to note that we're coming to the end of our conference now. We have 2 more sessions, one in about half an hour, and then our last one is at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And I wanted to note that at the end of that session, we're going to do a happy hour. So feel free to stay after that session is over or log on right at 4 if you'd like to just chat with the panelists from the past 2 days of the conference. And we'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Victoria,
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.